There's something that you've repeated quite a few times, which is that Africa's transition into formality, from an informal into the formality, and definitely the increased demand on cities, is driven by a desire to access or to unlock, I think, a lot of what cities offer. Can you help us understand how the poor are most impacted by displacement and what that translates to? So it's not just not having access to a house, but what are the spin-on and the knock-on effects?
Yeah. So I guess maybe looking at displacement, first you have to look at the reasons why some of the displacement is taking place. And I would say that there are kind of two main kind of drivers for mass evictions and displacement of people living in urban centers. The first one has to do with private property and large-scale speculation and developers. In many of these instances, the state has very conducive policies that support large-scale private developments. And in these private developments, one of the things that drives the property market is speculative practices. Particularly in many African countries, we're seeing large-scale investors from China, from the States, from Europe, buying up large amount of land and causing mass displacement of people. So in many ways, one of the things that needs to be addressed at the moment is this idea of how the state uses its planning laws and planning principles, planning legislation to control and regulate the private market. And I think that is fundamentally important. The second layer is where the state systematically displaces people for strategic uses. And in those instances, it isn't very clear in most instances why the state is doing some of those things, because displacement comes at a huge cost, especially for people who are already in a vulnerable situation, possibly on vulnerable land. So I always say that displacement and mass evictions is never a solution. It is basically an issue that emerges out of the conditions that surround urban development and so on. So in many ways, the cost of displacement is huge on the people. It does not solve the long-term problem of land and housing rights.
Can you help us understand what it would look like to have a pro-poor city backing access to housing within the Cape Town?
Sure. So Cape Town is a very classic kind of like post-apartheid city. During apartheid, obviously, was segregated across racial lines, and subsequent to apartheid, in my view, like a lot of the planning policies have persevered and in fact, almost deepened the kind of inequality across racial and class lines in the city. So as a result of this, we find a very peculiar pattern in Cape Town, where mostly black and colored people living on the periphery and mostly wealthy people and predominantly white people living in the inner cities. Now, this has obviously been sustained through the kind of planning legislation that we've had and the way in which the system supports private development. So you take an inner city neighborhood which was, even during apartheid years, very mixed across different races, across different religions, like Woodstock and Salt River. We've seen that as a result of things like tax breaks given to large-scale property developers, has enormously gentrified that particular area, which means that a lot of people that have lived there for 6 generations, either as renters or owners, cannot afford to live in those specific neighborhoods. So even though this is not happening under an apartheid regime, it is happening under a democratic dispensation, it is leading to the same kind of effects where poor and working class households are almost relegated to the periphery because they cannot afford to live in the inner city. We also have neighborhoods such as Camps Bay, Bantry Bay, Sea Point, where the starting selling price of a property is 10 million rand. Only, I would say, 2 out of 1,000 people can afford to live in a place like that, can afford that kind of property. In fact, the city's own documents say that 70% of the people living in Cape Town cannot afford to buy a property in Cape Town. 70%, that is huge, I mean, it's unimaginable that a city that's trying to claw itself out of the housing crisis is now stuck in a paradigm where, most of its population cannot afford to live in the same city. So I think a lot of progress is being made, or at least attempts are being made, where well-located land is being released for affordable and social housing. I also think the city is trying to experiment with some progressive ways of regulating the private sector, which is basically saying large developments that are, 2 million rand and upwards are mandated and are required in some ways to provide affordable housing in those developments. So I think all of these measures will go a long way, not just to kind of rupture the spatial planning of the city, but actually truly build affordable housing in the inner city, which is so very necessary because the cost of transport in Cape Town is so high, like many other cities, that it actually becomes it's actually a strange experience because most community members that we work with, they'll say it doesn't make sense to be employed at the moment because the amount of money you spend on transport makes it financially unfeasible to actually come into the inner city and work here.
Sure. So I hear you, and I think I really appreciate that summation because it's very much about rethinking our laws, making sure they're contextually appropriate, making sure that there's civic action and engagement between cities and citizens so that solutions that are put on the table are responsive to articulated needs, and then definitely about incorporating that agency of the people who are in fact making a contribution to the building of cities, even if it is in informal ways. So roping them into, I think, city solutions. Just to close, do you think that we can link some of the issues that you've addressed to the UN Habitat's transformation strategy?
Absolutely. I think a lot of and it goes to many different kind of strategies that the UN has put forward, particularly the transformation strategy. In many ways, a lot of the constitutions are signatories to many of the declarations that the United Nations have, and most recently with the SDGs, there's a strong link between a lot of the legislation that in countries have, like national legislation and so on, with what the SDGs and the transformation strategy speak to. So I think there is a direct linkage around some of these things. It is really around translating some of these things into more actionable and implementable plans, and obviously then keeping track of what impact it has in terms of actually delivering housing and rights to the people that need it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eddie. We've really appreciated having you and the wealth of experience that you bring to this. And thank you, I think, just for your continued activism and support of the state from the civil society side. It's been a pleasure having you in studio today.
Thank you.